I started my own entrepreneurial journey at kind of the dawn of the internet age. And I'm wrapping up my professional journey here at the dawn of AI, which honestly seems to be accelerating at a faster pace than what was going on in 1995. I had basically 2 weeks of cash left. I had sold everything that I owned. I moved onto my brother's floor in New York City. I'd borrowed $60,000 from my grandmother to build the square. And at that point, kind of a year and a half in, I had about $2,500 left. And one morning I woke up and I looked at myself in the mirror and I said, "Hey, James, you're destroying shareholder value." And I told myself if I ever was doing that, I would shut it down. And one thing that I see over and over and over again is the head co-founders. As you know, there's just too much to do in a startup company. Like no one person can do it. And I'd say my greatest failing really has been most of my startups I've done by myself. I'd say the second thing is the only thing worse than not raising enough capital is raising too much.
Welcome to another episode of This Is M&A. My next guest is the founder and CEO of Tuck Advisors, an M&A advisory firm built by a founder for founders. He's a four-time entrepreneur who helped pioneer the early internet, launching The Square, one of the first social networks, then Refer It, the first directory of affiliate programs, and later ReturnPath, which became a global leader in email solutions. He has sold companies both as a founder and an investment banker, including exits of businesses he's personally owned or invested in, such as HurryDate and Gigmasters, to public companies. And he's also led even more M&A transactions for his clients. He's been quoted in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, and he has also spoken at business schools, including Harvard, Wharton, and Columbia, among others. He came out of retirement after seeing that most investment banks only closed 35% of their deals. And he made it his North Star to build a firm with a significantly higher success rate. In fact, last year, he achieved 100%. In his spare time, he's passionate about functional medicine and nature, and he's an enthusiast of cars and motorcycles. For those of my audience who've met me, they know that we have a lot in common when it comes to cars and motorcycles. With that, everyone, I'd like to introduce my guest, James Marciano.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here.
Definitely, and it's a pleasure to have you. If you could just tell the audience a bit about the functional medicine side, what made you so passionate about that? Very different than the banking side, right?
Yeah, for sure. I just found that Western medicine didn't really get at root causes, and I had a number of issues in my life where pills and procedures really weren't the answer, and so I kind of dove deep into different areas of functional medicine, especially around energy frequencies. Mm-hmm. And I found relief in those sorts of alternative therapies where there just were none in traditional Western medicine. So we could talk all day about that, but yeah, that's where that interest comes from.
Appreciate you giving us a glimpse into that passion. Well, listen, I'm happy to have you, excited about today's podcast, as I am with most episodes, but today we're going to be diving into the founder journey, right? Not that glossy version, but the real in the trenches path of building, scaling, and ultimately selling a company the right way. So very few people have actually lived that full arc as many times as you have. So really looking to tapping into your experience. We're going to unpack a couple of key topics, building in chaos, right? Lessons from the early internet and what founders can learn today. How to sell your company, really the founder's guide, right? To preparing for an exit long before you ever get involved with an investment banker. The founder mistakes, 7 things that James would never do again after building 4 startups and selling 2. This is the kind of episode that if you're a founder and you're listening, you're going to definitely want to take notes on. So with all that being said, we have a lot to cover. So I'd love to just jump right in. James, where should we get started here?
We can get started in the chaos of 1995 if you like.
I'd love it because I think we're also in a bit of a chaos with all the geopolitical stuff going on and the chaos that we had with the pandemic. So yeah, love to jump in there. So yeah, let's take it from there.
Great. Well, I started my career out in consulting. So I had a degree from Harvard undergrad in social psychology. Worked in consulting for a couple of years in Los Angeles. I went back to business school at Dartmouth and then worked at what's now Accenture in their strategic services office in New York. And in 1995, fell in love with the internet. At that time, AOL or America Online was really the way to get online, and you plugged in your landline phone and you heard the modem kind of make these gargling sounds, and all of a sudden you were kind of up and kind of trying to surf around and see what was what. And so they were sending out millions of these floppy disks, and that's how you got online, these 3.5-inch disks in the mail. And I just kind of fell in love with it. I fell in love with this idea that you could, you had instant access to knowledge everywhere. And for the first time in my life, really felt like I knew what I wanted to do, which was to be involved in this emerging technology. And so I'm really grateful for the fact that I started my own entrepreneurial journey at kind of the dawn of the internet age, and I'm wrapping up my my professional journey here at the dawn of AI, which honestly seems to be accelerating at an even faster pace than what was going on in 1995.
Yeah. So the total, I mean, between the two, what a big difference, right? From the 90s to present, how quick information comes at you. I know when I'm on my phone, and if something's not pulling up like that, I'm like, oh my God, what's going on? I'm pulling my hair out, right? But I also, you just reminded me of the 90s where you waited 20 minutes for that modem to kick on and actually even connect to you online. So, but
yeah. That's right. And even registering a domain name, which of course we all take for granted now, you go on, you register your domain name in 30 seconds. Back in the day, there was only one company that was registering domains, and you had to send in a fax or an email, and they'd print out a piece of paper, and they kept renting out more and more warehouses to stack these printouts and these faxes. And it took 6 weeks, if you were lucky, to get a domain name. And so that none of that infrastructure was in place, including investors, certainly on in Silicon Valley on the West Coast, but where I was in New York, which might have been called Silicon Alley, we didn't have that infrastructure for angel investors, and so we were all kind of making it up as we went along. And the big change today, of course, is that we have all that technology, that infrastructure in place, and again, it just sets folks up to be able to start companies easily, which I think actually is a good thing, but can also be a bad thing, frankly.
Well, I'm definitely looking forward to kind of comparing and contrasting, building and selling a business then versus building and selling a company, in 2026.
Yeah.
Let's just take a step back and let's talk about the early days of Square. What did building a startup in the mid 90s actually feel like? Because I was part of that, but I wasn't part of running and building businesses at that time. I was just the guy at the bottom of the totem pole, So I'd love to get your input on how did that feel building an actual startup during that time?
Yeah, I mean, it was, it was frustrating. It was my first, the Square.com was my first startup. I was 30 years old at the time, really had, no idea what I was doing, didn't have a mentor. I liken it to being, in a dark room with your eyes shut, and you just start swinging, trying to hit something, right? You're just trying to figure it out. And you're just trying to figure out how do you even build a website at that time, and how do you start to market it? And so it was a lot of just trying to really figure it out. The one thing that I was pretty sure of is that I wanted to be around other people that were doing technology stuff. And so at the time, there was one building in New York City that was the first wired building, called 55 Broad Street, across from the New York Stock Exchange. On the other side was Goldman Sachs at 85 Broad. And so it was a building, and in order to be able to get an office space in that building, you had to prove you were a technology company. And at the time, the way you proved you were a technology company was you needed an email address. That was it. That was it. And I was there were a lot of firsts during that time, but I was the first person to ever publish a job ad in the New York Times for the internet. And I had to convince the woman at the classifieds in the New York Times to create a new section called Internet. Yep. And then we put in this job ad for the first ever hire in the internet space in the New York Times. So it was very early days.
What was the one thing that you felt that you really got? Well, actually, before I even dive into that question, let me ask another. You mentioned, it was frustrating. The nice thing about frustrating oftentimes is that's where the learning takes place, right? Yeah. Really, you learn from that. That's the beauty of startups. Even for myself, why am I a startup guru, and why do I just stay in startups? It's for that exact reason. I love the learning aspect. I love wearing multiple hats, etc. But what was the one thing you felt that you got right that allowed you to have that successful exit of that business?
Yeah, I talk about kind of being on a mountain and seeing something, and then from that mountaintop you can see the next thing. And so we had the Square.com, and we were trying to generate revenue from it. We were trying to raise capital, and it wasn't working. And so I was, leafing through, I think it was called DM Marketing News at the time, and they were talking about these affiliate programs. And Amazon had just launched their associates program, where if you put a link from a product on Amazon on your website, you could earn, 3, 4, 5% commission. And I was like, geez, I need to generate some revenue for this network that I've created, the social network I've created, until it can generate, subscription revenue or advertising revenue or whatever we're going to do. And so I started looking around for these other e-commerce sites that had links where I could put them on my website. And I found about 7. And then I was like, and then it dawned on me, geez, if I'm thinking about this and trying to find these links, maybe I should put together this thing that has all these links. And it'll be a 2-sided marketplace where e-commerce companies can put their affiliate programs on, and then webmasters, quote unquote, which is what we used to call it, ourselves back then, webmasters can find these programs and they can join these programs. Right. So that was the 2-sided marketplace, and there was a real revenue model to that. And that's what, I kind of got right, was being able to see that other mountaintop. I had basically 2 weeks of cash left. I had sold everything that I owned. I'd moved onto my brother's floor in New York City. I'd borrowed $60,000 from my grandmother to build the Square. And at that point, kind of a year and a half in, I had about $2,500 left. And I had one employee, and I said, "Hey, do you think you could build this thing?" And he's like, "Yeah." And he's like, "What do you want to call it?" And I said, "I don't know. Let's call it Refer It." And I just got really lucky. And 18 months later, we were able to sell that business.
That's awesome. Congrats on getting the grandmother the $60K from her. It shows your salesmanship, because grandmas require some selling.
Yes. I was very grateful.
They love to help. But they also do require some selling. I tried the same, and I didn't do nearly as good as you. I was like, "Hey, there's this company called NVIDIA. I got early access to investing in them. Grandma, can you give me $80K?" And she looked at me like, I was 18 at the time. She goes, "You're out of your mind. I'm not giving you $80,000,
That's unbelievable.
Yeah. If only it worked. And she did. Would be sitting in a different office.
Oh, man. What a story.
Right. But I know you and I, in our conversations building up to today, we talked about how you had to raise money right before a crash. Right. And, again, I am very familiar with that crash. In fact, I was installing data and communication, card access control systems back in the day. And I would go into a lot of these buildings, and all of a sudden when it crashed, it was crickets. All these buildings it was kind of like the real estate, right? Bubble when it burst. How did that shape you, right? Raising money right before a crash. Maybe if you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah. I mean, it was such an incredible moment in time, like you mentioned the offices. And so you have to, again, remember, I was in the technology building in New York City, the Rudin building, 55 Broad Street. Every single company in that building was a technology building. And we were the last company to raise capital in New York City. We raised on April 11th. The official crash was kind of like April 14th of 2000. And so we were the only ones that were still, paying our rent. And you would go floor to floor to floor, and you would just see these doors to the offices were open, and there were just computers everywhere and chairs and office equipment. And it was a ghost town. It was crickets. And I remember we had 50 investors in that round. I remember people, calling me up and, that week and saying, "Hey, can you reverse the wire transfers?"
Man.
So it was nuts. And it was a really, really amazing, incredible time. And of course, 2020 hindsight, I probably frankly would have kind of fired everybody, held onto that $6 million of cash. And then in about 6 months, I would have bought everything, right? Because there were all these assets that were just getting unplugged, and that was it. So we had a couple of revenue streams for the Square, and unfortunately, they just didn't pan out at that time. And there's a great movie called Silicon Alley Stories, which documents this, that talks about this whole episode.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, we wound up going through about $4 million of the $6 million. And then one morning I woke up and I looked at myself in the mirror and I said, "Hey, James, you're destroying shareholder value." And I told myself if I ever was doing that, I would shut it down. And so I called a board meeting. and I said, "Hey guys, this just isn't working. I think we should, I think we should sell the company." And so we had 7 publicly traded companies vying for the Square because they wanted the $2 million we had left in cash, because they were they were all cash starved.
Right.
And we wound up actually selling it to an angel investor, and he was also a Series A investor. He had sold his company to Yahoo, had taken a lot of money off the table, and then he wound up buying it and running it for the next 10 years or so.
Interesting. So true cash is king
Totally.
Example, right?
Totally.
When you again, you've built and sold companies in the early years, and then obviously now you're helping your clients buy and sell companies in the present. When you look at founders today, what are you finding that they're just overthinking that maybe that other generation simply just didn't have to worry about?
Yeah, I mean, so it is kind of meta, right? Like, I'm the guy who started these companies, sold them. I took angel money. I took venture capital. I became an angel investor. I became an LP in funds. So I really have sat, at every seat at the table, which I think, it does give me kind of a unique perspective on things.
Definitely.
I'd say there are differences. What I always say is there's too much capital and not enough TAM. So there's all this money, institutional money, legacy wealth, right? Looking to put it to work. It became much easier for anybody to invest in any kind of a startup, when the laws changed around that. So Uncle Joe could put $10,000 into something. So all of a sudden, there was just a ton of liquidity in the market, just in terms of, people able to raise capital that, frankly, I think honestly should have stayed working for somebody else, right? At least for some period of time. So a lot of young people was kind of like having, be a part of a garage band. It's like, hey, I'm going to do this startup. And so all these startups started to appear. And it was because there was a lot of money, and also the infrastructure was in place, right? Like, how much money do you really need to start a company these days, right?
Right.
$17 to register a domain, and you're off to the races. And so there's certainly a lot of positives to some of those barriers coming down, but I also feel like there's billions and billions of dollars that were kind of frankly wasted pursuing ideas with either CEOs that weren't strong enough or teams that weren't strong enough. And you can't all say that you're going after this $1 billion TAM and you're all going to get all of it, right? Because there's always other competitors trying to go after the same thing. So in certain ways, it's familiar to me and it's similar, but in other ways, it's very, very different than 1995 to 2000.
Yeah, I think what we're in now in 2026, and honestly, it was probably 2025, and really, if we reflect back even to the pandemic to some extent, what you're seeing is a lot more scrutiny, right? A lot more scrutiny. They're looking for the good founders. They're paying more attention to those things. They're really digging deep into the diligence. Diligence has lasted longer, right? I've seen it in the data room side of the business. I've seen deals go from 12 months to 14 to 16, not because it's a bad business, but just because diligence is being taken more seriously than ever, right? So, well, let's shift gears here a little bit, and let's talk about just selling a company, right? One of the topics we really wanted to dig into is kind of that founder's guide to selling your own company, because you didn't just build startups. You personally ran the sale of Hurry Date and Gig Masters. Talk to us about what should someone thinking about their selling their company. What processes should they be thinking about? What maybe they don't understand that they should be digging deep into as they think about selling their business, etc. Let's talk about that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I'll never forget. It was Christmas Eve. I think it was 1998, and I was in my office in New York at 55 Broad, and probably 11:30 at night. And I'm working away, and this guy shows up from Silicon Valley that we had been in touch with. He was in a business that was kind of related to the Square, and we're sitting there and we're just talking. And he said to me, "Know who you're going to sell your company to before you start it." And it was a little tongue in cheek, but I never forgot it. And so I do think there's ways to build your company. You obviously, entrepreneurs are essentially starting companies because they see an opportunity, right? They see something that's broken, they want to fix it. They see an opportunity in the marketplace, they want to go after it. So it is interesting to think about how you build the business and who's going to value it for the most, right? Because you can build it in one way, and a certain set of buyers are going to view that in a certain way, and other people are going to view it in another way if you build it in a slightly different way. So that's one of the things we talk talk to entrepreneurs about, hopefully several years before they're thinking about an exit, right? It's just like, I know there's, I'm sure you're like me, Steve, you've got a gazillion ideas in your head, and you could take your thing in this direction or that direction, and CEOs get kind of attracted to that bright, shiny object. But, the folks that I know, the entrepreneurs that I know, some of whom have worked for me and sold companies that were, sold for $100 million, $200 million, they get more focused, right? Not less focused.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a really important lesson. I think one of the most important things I've done related to Tuck Advisors is having the ability to say no early on, right?
Yeah.
No, we're not going to do that. No, we're not going to do that. And of course, being an M&A advisor that can add value to your client, you got to know the industry well. So initially it was kind of education. Now we do healthcare, we do a few other things, but you got to really focus. So I'd say that's a really important lesson.
I think that truly is a golden nugget for founders that are listening in. Is focus is so extremely important. In fact, I'm hearing it taught and spoken about in all these events I'm attending now more than ever. Is focus is like critical, because it is easy to go chase a shiny penny, but it's like, okay, you're going to go chase this shiny penny, but you haven't even built your marketing engine for your core business of your business. How are you going to go market and sell that, right? And I would like to say, I didn't make the mistake and do that. I've done it, right? We went, we bought a company, and guess what? We didn't have the resources to go market and sell it because we were struggling to market and sell our core business. And so at ShareVault, we're doing the same, right? It's all about focus. We are this. We're going to concretely nail this. And yes, we are going to expand past that, but you got to know when to expand, right? There's a time and a place, and you'll know it when it hits you. So.
Yeah, that's for sure. I'd say, the other thing I'd say is that, I've seen founders do this time and again where they're just trying to chase capital. And the thing is, if you build something of value, people will find you, right? And so to the extent that you have the ability to just really build something, get market traction, you don't need to worry about the capital if you're really building something of value. The one, I think we were going to get to this later on, but I'll kind of plug it now, is I have the opportunity to talk to hundreds of successful entrepreneurs, right, every year. It's really an amazing seat that I sit in now. And the one thing that I see over and over and over again is the head co-founders.
Yeah.
As there's just too much to do in a startup company. Like no one person can do it. And I'd say my greatest failing really has been most of my startups I've done by myself. And it's just a really hard, heavy lift.
Yes.
And so again, most of the time, and you may not even know these, famous companies, Google, Apple, whatever, they all had co-founders. They may not be as famous as the CEO's name, right? But they were there. And so I would say, as a founder trying to pursue your dream, trying to build something of value, you really need to find somebody who has, skills that are different than yours, but has the same passion and drive. And that, by the way, is if and when you are going to raise capital, right? And the irony here is that we all need to be raising less capital than we did because the tools and the technology are there, and SaaS tools are available, and they don't cost that much. Now, if you're trying to hire $1 million AI engineers, maybe that's a different story. But that's kind of the irony, is we actually need less. But when you do go to raise capital, the first question they're going to ask you is, tell me about the team. And when I was trying to raise capital for the Square, I remember VCs saying that to me. And, I didn't have a team. I didn't have a co-founder. And I was just like, I was arrogant. I was young and arrogant. And I was like, oh, well, what are they talking about? I can do this on my own.
Right.
No, that's just, you learn pretty fast. That's just not the case, right? You want to build something of value, you need to surround yourselves with great people and hopefully co-founders.
And I think, with co-founders, the benefit there is they're just as vested as you are into the success of it. So you don't have to sit there and hover over them, which is always the goal. You don't want to have to hover over anybody, but especially your co-founders, right? So, makes a lot of sense. I think that's a very interesting point. I think you also hit on another interesting point and kind of alluded to it a bit, is companies in an ideal scenario are bought, not sold. And I think some of what you're teaching here is exactly that, right? Is if you do the right things and you have the right target early on, they're going to find you, not you find them.
Yeah, we call them UFOs, unsolicited flattering offers, or unsolicited flying overtures, whatever you want to say. But we trademark UFO because half of all businesses are bought that way. When Alan Meckler called me, he had internet.com, and he called me up when I had referred, and he said, I want to buy your company. I said, I know you do.
Yeah.
I knew what he was doing. I knew it fit into his strategy. And so you need to be prepared for those UFOs. And the thing is that they can often be a real distraction, right? We know UFOs are typically a hoax. They're fake. They're going to fly away. And so that's one of the ways that we at Tuck Advisors start working with clients early on. We were just talking to somebody last week that got a UFO from Apple, right? He's trying to close a Series B, a $15 million round. So we talked to him. We said, hey, close that Series B. You're going to have a lot of dry powder. That's going to give you a stronger negotiating position for Apple. Once you close that, let's go back to Apple and let's say, hey, we're here. We'll listen, right? But we've got a strategy to keep building and driving. So you're absolutely right. Oftentimes companies are bought, not sold, but you need to be in the right position, in the right headspace, and really the right advisor can help with that. And if you're ready to sell your company through a global auction process, right, that could be the next step. But then you also could be like, hey, I got plenty of cash in the bank. I want to keep building. I'll listen up. It's a fiduciary responsibility to my investors, right? I'll listen to what they have to say. But otherwise, you don't want to waste a lot of time and energy. You want to keep your eye on the ball and keep building your business.
One, two, James, I mean, getting involved with the banker early on at that point where there's that unsolicited offer is extremely critical, because I've seen business owners who sold their business because they got an offer and they just ran with that one offer. Yeah. The problem is both you and I know the more seats at the table you can get, the better, right? Yeah. It's only going to drive value up. And that's where James or investment bankers come into the equation, where they really add the most value, is saying, okay, you got someone who's a seat at the table. Well, now let's go stack that up to what are others going to offer, right? Yeah. And you're seeing that happen within the marketplace today with some of these mega deals that are happening, right? What was the most recent one? I'm drawing a blank on it, but Warner Brothers, I believe it is, right? Warner Brothers and Netflix. Well, guess what? Now they have 3-4 people at the table, and it's a whole new dynamic of what value is going to get derived from that deal.
That's absolutely right. I mean, just to share one small example, we had somebody that was referred into us, which is how we get all our business, just kind of warm referrals, and he had 2 UFOs, which is not uncommon. Usually they come in 2 or 3, right? Again, because great companies don't go unnoticed for long. And the CEO was in his 70s. He wanted to sell. He had a number in his head, right? $10 million. Yep. And so the buyer said, hey, what are you looking to get? And he said $10 million. And lo and behold, you can guess, Steve, the LOI came back at $10 million. and then he engaged us. I said, look, don't do that again, right? Yeah. Let me talk to the other UFO. And I went on and I said, hey, you guys have been talking for 6 months now. LOIs are due next Friday. Oh, we can never get that done. We have so much more to talk about and learn. I said, no, listen, we've got an offer in hand. It clears the bar. My client's going to take that deal. So, either you're going to bid on Friday or you're not. It's totally fine either way, right? Yeah. So the following Friday comes around, LOI comes in, it's 20 million.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So exactly to your point. Am I a genius? No. It's just putting pressure on the deal, making sure that you set deadlines. Nothing happens without a deadline. Time kills deals. And so that's the value that a banker can bring. It's pretty obvious.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's funny. I got a short story I'll give. So, I lead from the trenches. Yeah, I don't sit in my office. My door's open. I take calls. I still front and center with customers, clients, etc. It's just who I am. It's ingrained in me. It helps me stay in tune with the business, right? Rather than waiting for things to filter through a frontline, staff. Yeah. But a little interesting story is I had this one client that I was talking to, and they go, hey, we want everybody to know who's in the data room, which is the polar opposite of what 90% of the bankers want to do, or even 98%, right? It's the polar opposite. And so Curious Steve says, tell me a bit about that. Why do you want to do that? He's all, I'm trying to drive competitiveness. I want them to know XYZ private equity firm is in here. I want them to know that we got other seats at the table, right? And that was his way of driving value within that deal.
We do something kind of similar, actually. We do something called an evergreen SIM, or SIM FAQs. So you think you're going to put everything into the SIM, but inevitably, right, people are going to ask you questions that weren't addressed. And so we have a document, and it mirrors the outline of the SIM. We still do it the old-fashioned way. By the way, we actually do a document. And so we have the sections, marketing, finance, whatever. And so when people ask questions related to those areas, we put those questions in the shared document, and then put the answers in. Why do we do that? Well, one is we don't want to have to answer the same question twice. And the second is, to your point, it shows that other smart people are asking smart questions and are involved in this process. So anybody who signed the NDA gets the SIM, gets access to the data room, and then also gets access to this evergreen SIM or SIM FAQs. It's the same idea.
Right. Well, there's some frontline experience, some learnings there for you founders, and the value that these bankers bring to the table to drive that value for your business. So hopefully you're taking down notes. With that being said, let's shift gears again now. Now let's shift gears and let's start talking about the 7 things James would never do again, right? So you've started companies, in fact, 4, I believe. Sold 2 of your personal, as well as sold obviously plenty of clients. What are some patterns that you've seen there?
Yeah, I'm probably gonna upset you, Steve, but like there's one that stands out so much more than the others. And then I'll talk about a few others. But really, what I mentioned earlier is having a co-founder. Especially if you're doing anything in technology that requires actual code to be written, which of course is easier now than ever with AI generated code. But again, I've talked to, we're coming up on our 10-year anniversary this year for Tuck Advisors. And, I've probably had, literally 1,000 conversations with founders in 10 years. And it just, when I actually meet a founder, that's a solo founder that's succeeded, it just, I could count them on my left hand.
Yeah.
You just don't see it. It's always it's a husband and wife. It's just two guys that met in business school, 2 women that, met in college, or a workplace. It's a daughter and her mother, whatever. It's always, 5, I've seen 5 brothers. And so as we've talked about, there's the real benefit of being able to share the workload. And there's also, it also cannot work out, right? You decide, somebody decides they don't want to work that hard, right? Or you have a difference in vision, or, it happens, right? And so that's tricky, that's hard. But I'd say that's really the number one thing. I'd say the second thing is the only thing worse than not raising enough capital is raising too much capital. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is when you have your back up against the wall, you need to figure it out. Like when I had $2,500 left in the bank and I needed to figure out what the hell am I going to do to stay alive here? And I was like, okay, we got, let's build this thing called Refer It, right? I have 2 weeks of payroll left for this guy, Kevin, and let's go build Refer It. So if you have a ton of money, right, you can really piss it away, right? You can waste it on a bunch of shiny objects. You can,
scale too quick,
whatever it is, right? You can try to hire too many people too fast. I mean, the hallmark of the companies that I've founded, they've always grown slowly. Why? Because I really just care about A+ players on the team, and it takes a long time to find those folks. So I really think that's a big mistake that companies make, is they get all this money and they just kind of waste it, and that's a real problem. And of course, in 2021, 22, the money was free, the valuations were through the roof, and it wasn't healthy for anybody. If you were in our morning huddles in 2021, 22, I mean, I was on my soapbox every morning, just shouting at the top of my lungs, "This is ridiculous!" Right? Yeah. None of it makes any sense. And the valuation at which you raise capital, that's very different than the valuation when you go to sell your company. And what was happening was investors were putting in money in deals at valuations that companies had to grow into. Yeah. Right? Yeah. That wasn't the case in 1995. And then, you might remember this, Stephen, 2002, 2003, that was kind of the invention of SaaS. People started talking about that, and people were not making money. So you couldn't even say, oh, what's a company worth based on EBITDA? Let's base on a multiples of top line revenue, because we have no other metric to use. Right. And so it all just got really kind of crazy and stupid. And there's certainly a hangover from that time period. And I think things have settled down a little bit. Of course, not the case in AI. Yeah.
I'm going to lob it. It's funny you say AI, because that's actually the direction I was going to go on this. I'm going to lob this to you. I've talked to founders as of late where they're building businesses with 5 founders, and it's only 5 founders, and they're getting to 100 million, right? And I think there's goals well beyond that to get there with just a few founders and very few employees. In fact, the last conversation I had, they called their AI agents employees, right? So they're like, oh, we have 200. I'm like, how many employees do you have? And this was a real conversation. He goes, oh, we have 250. I'm like, oh, wow. Okay. So you guys are a decent size. He goes, well, there's 245 employees that are AI agents, right? And then there's 5 founders. So the next question now I have is, are we going to meet a world where, to your point, you need founders where it's going to be an AI founder, right? Where these founders are going to say, I'm going to start a business, and these are my 4 co-founders, and they're AI agents.
So we have the same thing. We have, the names, first name and last names for our AI agents that we use internally for things, or emails. And my vision a couple of years ago had been that, because you and I, what's the most critical resource we have is our time.
Yeah.
So could your avatar and my avatar be having this conversation without us? We could be playing, ball with our kids or whatever, right? We're not there yet. But what we are seeing is agents talking to agents, right? And behind the scenes trying to figure stuff out. And so again, this is just, it's really incredible to think about the efficiencies that are being gained right now in every area of business.
Yeah.
And so I just think that there has never, ever been a better time to be a founder, to be a business owner. And it's awesome.
Yeah, I was having a very near and dear recent conversation with my executive staff, figuring out how do we get to 50% more efficiency with all the AI tools we're using, right? Because that's where the world is headed. 50% is a low bar, to be honest, right? So, and that is I consider that a super strength for ShareWalt. Being that we're a lean, mean, bootstrapped company, I don't have to go lay off 20 people because of AI, right? And I've seen, to your point, James, I've seen companies that were VC backed get 15, 20 million, 30 million dropped in their lap. And the first thing they do is they go hire 30 salespeople. But guess what? They don't have a proven model that says you can take 30 salespeople and get the ROI per employee that's going to allow you to survive in that world, right? And so naturally what happens 9 out of 10 times that I've seen is a year later, a workforce reduction, right? You're cutting your sales team down to 5 because only 5 were able to actually get you to where you need to get to from a ROI per employee perspective. So,
we keep trying to do more with the same. That's what we talk about, right? And before we add another employee, what more can we do? How can we double down on technology and process? And you have to remember, we talked about this county being meta for me as somebody who started a bunch of companies, invested in them and sold them, and now I'm doing that as my latest. I mean, we're 10 years old, but I'm always going to call us a startup. I'm sure you feel the same way, right? You're always going to be hungry. You're always going to try to figure out how you improve processes and procedures. We're changing our processes and procedures and our tech multiple times throughout the day. Right? That's not an exaggeration. We were the first company in the world to launch a custom GPT around M&A on February 1st of 2024. So we have fully embraced it. It is a part of our internal processes. It is a part of how we work with clients. And again, just super excited to have kind of lived this long and be doing business in this age where every day, I mean, you can't even keep up, right? That's the thing. And so, super exciting. The one thing I did think about coming out of retirement, I was retired for almost a dozen years when I decided to come and build this, was I had a checklist of things. And one of them was, what is it that technology will support but not disintermediate? Right? And so, for example, I said, being a truck driver, right? This is 10 years ago. Well, we're going to have autonomous driving at some point. I don't want to be a truck driver, right? So then I thought about M&A, and I thought, is somebody who spent their life building their company really going to trust, a robot or technology or a website to sell their company for them or to help them sell their company? Is this really a DIY kind of a thing? And so that's where I always say this, my social psychology degree, from Harvard is more valuable than my MBA from Dartmouth. Because yes, of course, the numbers are important, but ultimately at the end of the day, you're dealing with human beings and what they care about the most. We mostly deal with founders, kind of enterprise values, say $10 to $100 million. We're happy to do bigger deals. Sometimes we do smaller deals, but ultimately, it's enjoyable for me to be working directly with founders. And that's the important thing. What do you care about the most? And then from the buyer side, right? What do they really care about the most? What is their interest? Not a position, but what are their interests? Once I know people's positions, it's not helpful. Once I know their interests, it's helpful, right? I can figure out how to make it work. And so that is supported by AI. That is supported by technology, everything that we do. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, in 2026, human to human connection, even if it's just over Zoom, is still really important.
It is. In fact, I was just at an event and I was having a similar conversation with an individual, and sharing my perspective of what I've been seeing in the marketplace as a whole, right? Not just in my marketplace, but just from selling to marketing to everything else. And I'll be honest, I had a strong opinion of how much AI was going to be able to replace, and I still have a strong opinion of that, but it's shifted a little bit because what I'm seeing is kind of an interesting, something interesting evolve, which is I started to get to a point where early on I didn't think you replace salespeople, and then I started, well, hold on, now we're recording hundreds of thousands of millions of calls and emails, and I'm like, well, it might be possible, right? Because there's so much for these machines to learn from, because the pandemic forced everybody now online, right? A lot at a much larger, right? And so with that being said, that was my original opinion. And then now what I'm saying is, well, hold on. People are tired of bot to bot talking. They don't know if they're talking to a real person or a bot, and you can't tell if through video anymore. You're right, and all of those things. And so now what I'm seeing emerge is you actually want really great communicators that can do the face-to-face like we are doing right now. More importantly, out in the field, because people want that real. They yearn for that personal touch, right? And so it's actually making those great salespeople even more valuable than they've ever been. It's making those great investment bankers even more valuable than they've ever been. So,
I couldn't agree more. That ability to communicate with another human being. I mean, we all need that. We want that. I had a call with, I had to call my credit card company up this morning for something, right? Person was super friendly on the phone, very nice. We got done exactly what we needed to get done. And I have to tell you, I left that feeling, warm, feeling good, right? Yeah. Because so often we're just staring into our computer and doing emails or whatever. And so having that connection with somebody is just super important. And I agree with you. Good salespeople are more needed than ever. And of course, again, recording 1,000 sales pitch conversations, you can really understand how do we fine tune that pitch, right? Yeah. So there's all sorts of great data to do that. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you want a person doing it.
Agreed. Listen, we got to shift topics here again because we're at the top of the 40-minute marker, and we have a few more things to cover. This was a very great conversation. I think we could continue talking about it in length. But let's shift to you for a minute here. We talked about your diverse background and your experience, and both from a college perspective and everything else. Thinking back to your early childhood, is there some point in time that now you can reflect back to where you're like, wow, this is why I'm where I'm at today, or I did the same things I did then today that made me who I am today? Like for me, it was always my curiosity, right? I was just genuinely curious, and that's led me to where I'm at today because, why do you do that? Why do you do that? And so I, naturally learned a lot, right? So to that point, anything that you can point to?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, there's two things. One is, I grew up on a farm, and so we had a pretty strong work ethic from the word go, right? We got up before the sun came up. We went to bed after the sun went down. My parents didn't go to college. I was the first person in my family to go to college. And having said that, my parents really valued education and really scrimped and saved to send me to a private school in Princeton, where most of the people were, driving around in brand new Ferraris and Porsches. I was driving a beat up old pickup truck that people make fun of. So I had that kind of chip on the shoulder that, maybe Tom Brady had for being drafted so late in the draft there. I think that helped me just give me that, that edge that said, I love the farm life, but I don't want to go back to that. So what am I going to have to do? And so I think that it was really that that helped to shape who I am, and kind of work with what I have, right? Like we maybe didn't always have everything, right? If an engine blew, we couldn't have afford to, get some mechanic over to fix the engine. So my brothers and I would have to rip the thing apart and figure it out. And so I think it was just, growing up at the farm for me had a lot of really important consequences in terms of how I've dealt with life later on. And as the number one thing is being able to dust yourself off, pick yourself up when something goes wrong. And that's the number one thing as an entrepreneur. Things are not going to go smoothly. I was just talking to a young a young man that I mentor that just raised Silicon Valley money, and we were just talking about the things you need to be successful. And I said, hey, I know you're going to be able to overcome this thing. You just lost a big B2B sale. And I said, hey, you can afford to let yourself feel bad for about a day, and then you got to get back up and start doing it. And that's what it's like for us here. We always, there's always going to be something that kind of hits you in the gut. But unless you can bounce back and you have that resilience, you're not going to be successful. And I think that's what my childhood taught me.
Yeah, I have a very similar childhood, and I think when it comes to resilience, I think you hit on resilience. I think that is so important, and that hard work ethic, that drive. It's the getting knocked down, and just like to your point you just gave, getting right back up. It's the people who get knocked down and stay down, or sit there too long, right? That's what drags you really down, and businesses fail. So, I think your point is definitely sits well with myself. As far as, I think it's with my background, as I mentioned, I'm very similar. It's sometimes even today, it's hard to let go and say, hey, don't go fix the car. Right. This weekend, I spent 11 hours putting a new suspension and brakes on my truck. I could have easily paid someone, have the cash to do it, but I ended up still doing it. Right. So
you enjoy it, right? That's your hobby. You enjoy it. So that's
exactly.
All right.
Yeah. It becomes a passion. Well, James, how do people get in touch with you? I know they're going to like this lively conversation. Why should they get in touch with you? Maybe just, tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I know this is M&A, and we talked probably 95% about other stuff. So just a quick kind of pitch on Tuck Advisors. I came out of retirement to help other entrepreneurs sell their companies. We now also do buy-side work for the last 5 years, helping companies, private equity backed or not, with tuck-in acquisitions. We focus on companies having a positive social impact. So do a lot of work in education, do a lot of work in healthcare. We're also trying to do more work in areas of sustainability, safety, and even the pet space. I mentioned growing up on a farm. I love animals. Always my best friends. And so if you have something outside of that, but it's still, values driven, mission driven, feel free to reach out to us. You can go to tuckadvisors.com. You can find us there. If you want to email me directly, it's just james@tuckadvisors.com. That's easy. Always happy to have a conversation, whether you're looking to go out through a global auction process, or whether you've gotten one of these UFOs and you need help negotiating that, or you're looking to potentially do some tuck-in acquisitions.
Perfect. And we'll make sure we drop your info in the comments. For all of our listeners, if you like this episode, please subscribe, love to have you follow us and keep in tune with the conversations that we're having. With all that being said, James, this was a great conversation, as I mentioned over and over. I really appreciate you dedicating your time to jump on this call to help educate our founders, our entrepreneurs, and our listeners, so that they can either avoid a mistake that can be avoidable, or they do something really good in their business based on some of the feedback and some of the comments that you made about running a successful business. So thank you very much for joining.
It's been my pleasure, Steve, and hopefully we'll get a chance to do some wrenching together somewhere.
Definitely. That would be a blast.
Yeah.
So that's a wrap on another episode of This Is M&A. I look forward to seeing all of you on the next episode. Until then, stay sharp and stay deal ready.
If this episode sharpened your thinking, share it, post your take, follow the show, or drop a quick review and bring it into your next deal. We'll be back with more real talk from people who've been in the room when it counted. The views and opinions expressed on This Is M&A are those of the guests and hosts and do not necessarily reflect the views of any company or organization mentioned. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal, financial, or investment advice. Always consult a qualified professional before making business decisions.